in Coney Island with this dickhead.
Radio Free Innsmouth episode 284. Hey kid,
오야 진짜.
y'all ever heard of Rainbow?
아니 촬영 같은 거 하다 보면은
No, not the modern stuff associated with rainbows, you know, the...
I may not know my flowers, but I know a bitch when I see one.
sort of lifestyle choices. No, we're talking about the old heavy metal band Rainbow from the 70s, featuring Cozy Powell doing stuff like... and the great Richie Blackmore doing stuff like... and Tony Carey or Don Airey or whoever the heck could put up with the great Richie Blackmore's tomfoolery long enough to get through a whole album working with a guy who's apparently a bit of a butthole.
How about this humidity?
Doing great keyboard stuff like... and perhaps most notably of all, you had everybody's favorite... bringing in that... and all of those... you know, all that great Dio stuff. At least on the first three Rainbow albums. I've actually come to enjoy the fourth Rainbow album from 1979 with Graham Bonnet on vocals over the years after not really liking it at all for years and years. I guess I'm going soft. Faggot! But regardless, at least those first three Rainbow albums, I think most metalheads will agree, that stuff was very much incredibly ahead of its time as far as basically inventing a lot of modern-day power metal tropes and was hugely influential, and yet at the same time, I don't know how many bands out there quite sound like Rainbow. There's bands that have taken elements of what Rainbow did, but it kind of seems like the metal scene wasn't entirely interested in directly following up on what Rainbow had going on.
Or were they?
Well, this week, we do have a band that sort of functioned as a direct stylistic follow-up to Rainbow, that being the great band Terra Rosa from Japan.
I know what you're thinking.
Why would I want to listen to a Rainbow clone when I can just listen to Rainbow? I'm gonna skip this shit and get back to Manila Road, dude.
There are many reasons why that would be a bad idea. I will illuminate 3.
Well, you see, the 3 Terra Rosa full-lengths that exist are actually amazing, and you'll note that
I didn't.
insinuate that they were a Rainbow clone in my initial description of them. I said they followed up on Rainbow's style. They pushed it into some incredible new directions on these 3 albums, and that's why we're talking about them today. So Terra Rosa came to my attention largely because of the great Japanese band Dead End, who I covered on episode 225 of this program. You see, guitarist Yuji Adachi, kind of like the main creative driving force behind Dead End, was a member of Terra Rosa way back in the early 80s. He left before they put any albums up, but they used at least one of his songs that he wrote on their first album. And as much as I like Dead End, Terra Rosa's got 3 albums that are all spectacular, whereas Dead End has a pretty cool debut, 2 albums that are spectacular, and then another 3 albums that I could kind of take or leave. So while they might not be as well known as Dead End, Terra Rosa got the better KDR in that match. Now, Dead End never really struck me as a band that was heavily influenced by Rainbow, but ironically, the one song that the guy from Dead End for sure wrote for the first Terra Rosa album is kind of the most classically Rainbow-sounding Terra Rosa song on that LP, and a good place to start if you're trying to get into their music. It's got that same sort of Middle Eastern feeling to a lot of the guitar melodies that was present on Rainbow's second album, as well as some very heavy 70s, retro for the time, this is 1987, style heavy metal organ work. Vocalist Kazue Akao putting a rather non-standard performance in as far as Japanese female vocalists go. Not really the standard kind of cutesy stuff that I love so much at all. That she's got a real thick, powerful voice. Definitely has elements of Dio to it, but she's also definitely got her own style. Somewhat comparable to Yoko Kubota from Saber Tiger, though Kazue did it first. And she does a great job of kind of varying up her style to match the ever-shifting emotions of the songs. Most of these songs are quite long, have a whole lot of different sections, very prog rock sounding, and not just because of the keyboards. There's a real sense of classically oriented orchestration to everything, much like their major influence Rainbow. And just like with those first 4 or so Rainbow albums, you can expect a whole lot of very long and involved trade-off sections between the guitars and the keyboards. A whole lot of dueling solos, which is one of this band's most notable signature features. Funnily enough, they never really had a steady guitarist. They got a different one on each album. The main songwriting core of the band was always the keyboardist, the vocalist, and the bassist, who I guess each of which had a strong enough personality to ensure that despite shakeups and other parts of the member list, these albums all follow a fairly logical progression from one to the next. But getting back to that first album, it's not like every song sounds exactly like Rainbow. They've also got kind of punchier, more hard rocking, more Japanese sounding numbers. For instance, the oddly titled Friday's Free Fare wouldn't sound that out of place on a Dead End album or even a Seiki Matsu one. It just has that additional instrumental coloration from the heavy keyboards. It's got a cool sort of loudness bridge between groove-oriented hair metal and kind of proto-power speed metal sound to it, with those 70s aesthetics still being a major factor. Very unique sound. Kind of a 70s meets 80s sort of thing. And Kazue's very soulful vocals are a perfect build-up to one of the coolest keyboard riffs I've ever heard. Check this part out. Sounds like something out of a soundtrack to an 80s action movie. I love it.
Some steam venom.
So while it is one of the simpler songs, it's one of my favorite ones on the album. But as I intimated early on, one of the major trademarks of this band is how weird and kind of prog rockish they get. They kind of take the Rainbow style and do something a little bit darker, stranger, and more morbid with it. Notably on the opening track of the album, entitled One of Sections, space, open quotation, lap, close quotation. Because even for a Japanese band, these guys got weird song titles.
He's dyslexic. What's that got to do with it?
Notably, the guitarist on this album utilizes a lot of really harsh and shrill cutting bar chord work. Not really something you'd associate with a very smooth Rainbow-sounding 70s band. Another example of this band sort of 80s-ifying the Rainbow sound would be the inclusion of these very new wave of British heavy metal style gallop riffs. Hearing the keyboards float over those is kind of surreal. But what they did take away from Rainbow for this song was a great sense of narrative progression, particularly as we listen to Kazue very upper vocals for the pre-chorus to the pre-chorus to the pre-chorus to the chorus. Like I said, these songs are pretty complicated. Then we got this 70s metal equivalent of a thrash break type thing going on here, with a real weird bendy whammy bar solo over it. Rather futuristic sounding, fitting for what the band is about to do when they come out of the solo. And Skynet takes over. Some super strange, like robot vocals or something. Like I said, a little bit darker and more morbid than Rainbow usually is. They're not just aping the Rainbow sound, they're following up on it and adding their own weird elements. And this would continue on the second Rainbow album, came out 2 years later, entitled Honesty. But like I mentioned earlier, they got a different guitarist for each album, and despite that, this sounds like a pretty darn good follow-up to a classic like The Endless Bassist. They start to incorporate a little bit more of that sharp 80s hard rock sound, particularly in regards to the guitar tone, but also with that real thick, clonky 80s gated snare drum, which again helps give off sort of like an 80s action movie soundtrack vibe that I enjoy. There's also much heavier usage of palm muting on this album, but it's not like they just lock into a groove and kind of stay there and grind the music out. There's a real sense of subtle variation of what's going on. Like watch when the chugs come back in here. They start out with a simple one-note riff, but then they do these weird little tail-end accentuations before then jumping into some really cool, sustained vocal performance from Kazue. You know, not quite Messiah Marcolin over-the-top vibrato, but it's noticeable. It's classy stuff, man. This band is subtle and classy. Might be their two most notable attributes. Speaking of two very notable attributes, we're about to jump into one of their best guitar and keyboard duet sections, initiating right as we come out of another big vocal build-up. The initial hit is this real grungy organ tone doing all these little widdly-wah bits, before then linking up with the guitars to do this odd multi-layered arpeggiated melody that... Damn, that's fucking sick. There's even something in the background that almost sounds like a theremin or something. I kind of want to put these guys in sort of their own weird little mini genre. Call it, I don't know, fantasy metal or something. It would include, the first 3 Rainbow albums, most of Dio's stuff in the 80s, first and third Sabotage album, a lot of the Tony Martin era Black Sabbath, first 2 Dio era Black Sabbath albums, and probably the first 3 Ozzy albums. But I don't want to play any of that Ozzy stuff for the sake of musical comparison, because last time I did that was on the Dead End episode where I had to friggin' fight a copyright claim for like 2 weeks.
God damn it!
But speaking of Dio and Tony Martin era Black Sabbath, there's quite a few aesthetic commonalities between that stuff and certain songs on the second Terra Rosa album. Notably with the inclusion of some very heavy groove riffs, but even more noticeably with the preponderance of what I can only call an Eye of the Tiger style bass line.
I should have broke your thumb!
But given a weird, almost kind of goth rock twist, with some additional clean guitar layers and these really cool floaty kind of keyboards, as Terra Rosa went on, they kept the wacky 70s organ stuff, but they also started to experiment with all sorts of weird keyboard sounds, kind of jumping between these very liquid sounding ambient bits and much harder and heavier grinding metal organ noises. I feel like had Rainbow not gone down the AOR route, they might have gotten into making material like this towards the end of the 80s. That combo of the palm-muted guitar melodies and that bouncing bass line, certainly some powerful stuff. And again, a lot of this has that very 80s soundtrack kind of feeling to it. So those first 2 friggin' Terra Rosa albums, they're great. The third one seems to be rather overlooked, even by Terra Rosa fans and Terra Rosa themselves. They did anniversary tours where they played each of the first 2 albums in their entirety, but poor Sase from 1991 didn't get any such treatment. I don't know, maybe it has something to do with COVID. But yeah, I don't even see Terra Rosa fans talking about this one that much. I don't know if it's the friggin' cover, who's got a big old gross bug on it.
Though this may be shocking, I do not encourage people to just pick up random bugs and start eating them. That's gross.
Or maybe it's just because it came out in 1991 and people figured it would be a sellout album. But it's not. Actually, Sase might be my favorite Terra Rosa album. Because yeah, it still has that Rainbow sound to it, but on this one, they really take it into some strange areas. For starters, the more like riff-oriented groovy songs are a lot heavier this time around. Partially because the production's a bit more modern sounding, but also because the riffs themselves have a real sense of chunkiness to them. This is also probably Kazue's heaviest vocal performance. This song in particular, entitled Carry It Out, it's the one Terra Rosa song that's been consistently in my gym playlist, mostly because of this riff coming up right here. I mean, are you hearing that fucking beast of a riff? That is some nasty shit. Speaking of which, the solo section on this song, probably my favorite of everything Terra Rosa has done in that regard. Cool trade-off between the keyboards and the guitars there. It's shreddy without being show-off. And then when they link back up together, they hit on this really cool, simple sort of melody. But then the guitar starts adding in all these extra little flourishes, kind of floating around it. I think this guy might be my favorite of the 3 different Terra Rosa guitarists I've heard. He's probably the most 80s sounding, which is funny, because this album came out in the 90s. And you gotta bring back that brutal fucking riff for the outro of the song. I mean, you can't let something like that go to waste. And what a fucking outro this is. Climbing out of that cavernous riff cacophony back into maybe my favorite Kazooie vocal performance of all time. Going totally nuts with the Dio style layering and improvisation. Such a cool fucking song. Such a cool fucking album. And such a cool fucking band. Listen. Sometimes I get busy and I do a shorter, easier episode. That's what this one was. Terra Rosa. Excellent, heavy fucking metal. If you don't like it, you're a poser. But even then, thanks for listening or watching anyways. And I'll see you around.
Stop the fucking chit-chat. I gotta go.